What's going on, guys? Thanks so much for tuning into today's episode. I'm sitting down with Dr. Lisa Lewis, and we're going to be talking all about nutrition, exercise, and mental health. So if you are new, welcome to the podcast, and thanks so much for tuning into today's episode. As always, if you enjoy the podcast, just make sure you smash the subscribe button and turn on notifications to let you know every time a new episode drops, which is every single week on Wednesday. So Dr. Lisa Lewis, thank you so much for jumping on. It's great to have you here. Can you tell the listeners a little bit about who you are and some of the work that you've done relevant to today's topic?
Yes. Thank you for having me, first of all. And I am a licensed psychologist. I come from a psychotherapy background. So by trade, I'm a person who has private conversations with another person about some aspect of their life, which could be anything from their mental health to goals they have in their life to ways they want to change themselves, grow themselves, or evolve. The reason that I'm coming in to talk to you on these topics is because after finishing a master's degree in clinical psychology and working with people who had mental health problems for a while, I went back to school and got a doctoral degree in counseling and sports psychology, which has more of a focus on thriving, flourishing, kind of positive aspects of psychology beyond just correcting mental health. And in my professional life, after graduating, I have had the opportunity to do a lot of speaking engagements and work with fitness business owners, other kinds of fitness professionals, and fitness enthusiasts and athletes on how to motivate, how to change and grow, and how to really integrate mental health and fitness into a lifestyle that is sustainable over time.
Awesome. Yeah, and my first introduction to you was when you were presenting at the Kabuki Education Week. It was a really, really great presentation. And that was one of the reasons why I reached out in the first place, was because I thought you had a lot of really great insights and a lot of great information. And I think this is something that really is lacking. There's a couple areas that I think are really lacking, especially in the strength sport world and bodybuilding kind of circles, which is like talking about mental health, talking about eating disorders, talking about kind of some of the things that are outside of, just reps and sets and macros and things like that, that tend to really, spill over into your execution of those things. And so I'm really interested to kind of hear what you have to say. And I guess a good place to start would be just kind of talking about and giving like sort of a baseline of what mental health is. Like, what is that scope? A lot of people talk about it. A lot of people say, oh, I'm taking a mental health day, or, doing this to improve my mental health. But it's kind of rooted in this sort of really vague and ambiguous, kind of mysterious gray area. So can you give a little bit more of a concise description of, what you mean when you say mental health? And so we can kind of root the rest of this discussion.
Yeah, I 100% agree that it's pretty nebulous what it means to have mental health or what mental health is. And often people describe it by what it is not. They'll say it's not depression, it's not anxiety, it's
exactly.
not dysfunction. So mental health means that an individual is able to be productive in their life, enjoy their life, and cope with life. Meaning that they can be resilient. So someone with mental health is not a person who doesn't have any problems, but they are a person who can incur their problems, meet them head on, cope with them, or figure out strategies for coping with them. And at the same time, they can be functioning in their relationships and either at work or in school, whatever their roles are. So it's basically being able to handle your business and being able to enjoy your life.
So I really love the one distinction you made as well is, how you said it's not a person without problems, because that's a lot of the times what I think people get caught up in is they're like, oh, I have so many problems and it's stressing me out. And it's like, you know what? Stress is normal. This is completely, you don't have depression. You don't have this. And I mean, obviously I'm not saying this to people. I'm not diagnosing anyone, but I mean, I think a lot of times people jump to conclusions about things because they have some sort of negative experience or something like that. And they tend to over dramatize their life. And so I'm really glad that you kind of made that distinction there. And is there sort of I know you did kind of outline a bit of a baseline, but I also think that people tend to be a little bit polarized on this as well. And they think it a little bit more of like an on-off switch as opposed to like a volume knob in terms of where you sit on that spectrum of mental health, let's say.
Yeah.
Can you just kind of touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, mental health is a very broad spectrum, and we tend to have a set point or like a zone where we hang out in. So there is plenty of evidence to indicate that some of our kind of baseline is genetically predetermined. So for example, if you have a set of parents who have dealt with depression in their life, or you know that anxiety runs in the family, that might impact your set point. And what that also means is how high or how low you might be able to go on that mental health spectrum. So if 0 is like extremely depressed and you don't want to live and you can't function and you don't have any relationships and you don't want to go on, and 10 is like Zen master, happy go lucky, rainbows and butterflies. Think about 5 as being right in the middle. And if somebody's right in the middle, mood in the middle, I think about it like M&Ms. They have a zone. Maybe during good times, they're a 6 or a 7. And during really hard, stressful times, they float down to a 4 or a 3. So we all have a genetic predisposition, and then we all have kind of a zone. So even people who are very, very happy or tend to have a lot of positive emotion in their life, they can have tough times where they float down a little bit, and they could increase their happiness. But people who deal with depression in their lives or a lot of anxiety in their lives, it can really, really bring them down and get in the way of their life. Or they can improve and move that number up, but maybe not to a 10 or a 9, the same way somebody who's, got really, really happy genes or parents might. So we know there's this idea of a set point and a range of emotions that somebody can have. I think the trick for people who are listening is to understand what are the things in your life that help you to get to that upper limit, the upper end of your reaction range, if you were to super geek out. So what are the things that cause your anxiety to be lower, your mood to be higher, your sleep, your appetite, your sex drive to kind of be at their optimal level? And what are the things that bring you down? And then how do you create a lifestyle around that to get to that highest level of your reaction range? And what do you do when you notice those things bringing you down to the lower end? So that's where choices and lifestyle and getting support really come into play for mental health. It's not that it takes away problems. It's just that it helps you to maximize, your personal range of mental health and getting to that upper limit.
Yeah, I think I love the description you just gave. And that's one thing that I like to talk about a lot of, not necessarily from the standpoint of mental health, but is just resiliency,
Yes.
right? Like, a lot of the times people will say what is it? Just like one of those like Nike quotes. It's like, it doesn't get easier, you just get stronger or something like that. I don't know. But you know what I mean? As cliche as it sounds, that really is what it is, like.
Absolutely.
I actually think that training gets exponentially harder the better you get. It doesn't get easier. You know what I mean? Like,
amen. Yeah.
But it's just a matter of like, you stop expecting it to be easy. And one of the things that I love when people say is, I'll have some of my athletes and they'll be like, oh, it's so heavy. I'm like, your sport is literally lifting heavy weights. Are you surprised? Like, what are you talking about? Of course it's heavy, but how did it move? You know what I mean? And so I think sometimes too, that translates into maybe how we perceive, certain situations, and that can obviously be really impacted by the environment, which is just kind of what you were saying. And I would actually love to get your feedback on how the environment interacts with your sort of biological set points, and what some of those things might be that actually do interact to cause maybe negative affect or positive emotions, and how those things can kind of vary depending on your experience. Because, my experience dealing just with myself, and then also maybe some other people, is a lot of the times, there's kind of like this victim mentality of like, oh, I'm broken, I'm this, I'm that, woe is me. And then there's kind of the opposite end where it's like, oh, everything is because of me, everything is my fault, and so there's either like this complete lack of responsibility, or accepting way too much responsibility for things that have nothing to do with you. It's like, oh, there was an earthquake and my house split in two, but I should have known that and bought a different property in an area that didn't have earthquakes. And it's like, okay, I think that's a little bit too much, but can you kind of talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So what you're describing is, in the literature or in psychology speak, is locus of causality. So locus means where's the center, and causality means what caused that. So when an individual has a really high level or highly internalized locus of causality, it means, I am in control of my life. I am determining my destiny. I take ownership for the things that happen around me. I am the major variable that is influencing these things around me. What's beneficial about that is that those people tend to have agency. They tend to feel competent. They tend to take responsibility for things. What's hard about that is there's a lot of stuff in life that happens that's outside of our control. So when individuals start to say, we lost the game or the competition because I, didn't do my special hand clap dance routine before the game, that's a little bit too much. And that can bring you down. On the opposite end of the spectrum, people who have a very external locus of causality is like, life is total chaos. I have nothing to do with the outcomes that happen. Like there's all these other forces that are at play, and I'm just this like powerless, kind of seashell on the seashore getting whipped around. And so what's positive about that is it's much less stressful. What's hard about that is there's no ownership, there's no agency, there's no sense of having control or autonomy in one's life. So there are pros and cons to each end of the spectrum. And what we want people to be able to do is be flexible. And what flexible means is seeing things in life that happen as unstable, which means it means you can't predict. There's no fatalism. You can't say, I'm always going to lose a competition because I'm a loser, or I'm never going to deadlift X amount of weight because I never have been able to before. It means you say, I was super dehydrated and I was in a bad mood and I had just done a heavy lift the day before. Or it means you say there's all kinds of things that make this outcome unstable. And maybe the next time I'll be able to do it. It helps people to be able to be flexible in their thinking, and so that they can take ownership for the things that they have control over and maybe let go of the stuff or account for variables that are outside of their control.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great point that you said about the deadlift and being dehydrated, right? Because there's this kind of a fine line between identifying legitimate reasons for why something happened and then looking at that and being like, okay, that I can control. Make sure I'm hydrated, make sure I get enough sleep, do all that stuff.
Yeah.
That being a very productive way of looking at things versus, oh, it's because of this, and just kind of making excuses. Like, even though those two things seem very similar on the surface, they're very different in terms of like the intention and potential future outcomes that they could definitely create. So that was a really great example. I read a systematic review actually several years ago about like the impact of non-pharmacological interventions on depression, anxiety, PTSD, and things like that. And so this was several years ago, so absolutely feel free to completely correct me if I'm just wildly wrong on this. But one of the things that it was talking about was it listed a handful of things or interventions that were really, really effective, again, outside of pharmacological interventions. And they listed nutrition, exercise, having a job, having a significant other, and then having an active social life. And I thought those were all pretty interesting. And obviously the ones we're going to kind of really expand on today are going to be the nutrition and the exercise. But I mean, I wanted to kind of get your feedback on that and see like, how far off am I on my understanding of that being accurate?
No, can I get an amen right there? I mean,
okay,
that
awesome.
is wellness. That is when people say like, what is wellness? You can think of kind of a pie chart. And inside that pie chart are all the components that you just mentioned. And so taking care of your wellness is prevention and it is intervention. And when we talk to people, or, if you've ever known someone or been someone who's depressed or very anxious or dealing with trauma, all of those aspects of your life, there is distress and impairment. Distress means it feels bad, it makes you hurt, and impairment means you can't function properly. So I love what you just outlined. And the other thing I love about it is that there's lots of inroads there. There's lots of slices in that pie. So somebody can start, let's say they hate exercise, they can start with nutrition. And that road of nutrition is going to lead them eventually to exercise. So I think that all roads lead to Rome when it comes to wellness, and you can always begin with what the person feels most interested in or capable of.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. There's definitely a lot of interrelationship there, especially even just like the social aspect, right? Like in powerlifting, you have kind of powerlifting clubs. I mean,
Yeah.
at my gym, there's a pretty tight knit community there, and everyone there is like, really good friends, and you can develop a lot of relationships there. So it's that's pretty cool. Um, so I guess that kind of brings me to the next question. Like, what sort of impact does, fitness and exercise and things like that actually have on mental health? And I guess we can kind of stay in the realm of, like, I guess, depression, anxiety, PTSD,
Hmm.
since at least for me
Yeah.
anyways, those are the ones that I hear most about within the fitness sphere.
Yeah. It's 99% completely awesome and fabulous. And it is medicine because exercise and fitness impacts neuroplasticity in a really positive way. So, one author that I like to refer to a lot is John Ratey. He's a psychiatrist here in Boston, through Harvard University. And years ago, he wrote a book called Spark, which I think is still very relevant today. And essentially, John Ratey's position is that the effect of exercise is on the brain, that it affects BDNF, which is brain derived neurotropic factor, which he calls miracle grow for the brain. So it impacts your brain and its neuroplasticity in a positive way. And he says basically a side effect of exercise is getting stronger, getting leaner, having cardiovascular benefit. He's like, all that physical stuff is like a happy side effect. And I think we usually think of it as the inverse, that maybe a side effect or a benefit is how we feel mentally. And then the chapters in his book are chapter 1 is about exercise and attention, how exercise really enhances your ability to attend and consolidate memory. The next chapter is on exercise and depression. So he talks about the interplay between exercise, BDNF, and serotonin levels. Also increases in self-esteem, which of course impacts depression. The next chapter is on exercise and anxiety. And on and on and on. And so what's happened since he's written that book over the last 15 years is there's been this huge, fabulous body of research in all these different areas about beneficial impacts of exercise on these areas, and also notably on trauma. So the authority on trauma is Besser van der Kolk. He wrote a book years ago called The Body Keeps the Score, which is really about how your physiology and your neurology is impacted by trauma. And part of the what to do about this part of the book is being engaged with your body, being in touch with your body and using your body autonomously and with agency, which can include exercise and physical activity. A friend of mine just wrote a book called Lifting Heavy Things, which is about powerlifting and weightlifting for the treatment of and recovery from trauma. Really cool book. So any way you slice it, exercise is extremely fantastic for your psychology and for your brain. And I said 99% instead of 100 because, yes, there is risk of addiction. You mentioned eating disorders before. If you have been in the world of powerlifting or figure competing or even CrossFit games, there are extreme examples of people who continue in their eating and exercise habits, even though it is causing them injury, distress, impairment. Maybe they're choosing it over relationships or going to work or other things. So there are exceptions to the rule, but I would say the rule is exercise is absolutely amazing and crucial really for your mental health and well-being.
Yeah, and I mean, especially like after coming out of COVID now. So I'm living in Calgary for the time being, and Canada had some of like the craziest restrictions.
Yeah.
And the number of suicides and the number of like utilization of the hotlines and all these different resources for suicide prevention just absolutely skyrocketed.
Yeah.
And it's like the big outcry was like, we need to get out, we need to be active, we need to be, and I mean, essentially exactly what I was saying. It's like, okay, people are losing their jobs, they're losing their relationships, their partnerships, they're not exercising. And that's impacting their ability to probably eat healthy and things like that, because I would imagine they're probably utilizing that now as like some sort of like consolation mechanism, or not mechanism, but you know what I mean?
Reward. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Escape.
And it's pretty crazy actually. So it's nice to see the gyms opening up and like just even talking to people and they're like, oh my God, I feel so much better now that I'm
Yeah.
exercising. So it's really not surprising. And actually it was pretty interesting because I can't remember where I read this from, but I remember reading a paper a long, long time ago, and it was talking about how exercise is the number one thing to prevent cognitive decline as you age.
Number one. It is
And
the number
yeah,
one thing.
and it's kind of funny because you would think like intuitively it would make sense to be like, oh, well, maybe reading or doing things that are cognitively demanding, but it's like, no, apparently just regular physical exercise is like the best thing you can do, which is kind of crazy, you know?
It's really fascinating to me. In the fall, I attended a neuropsychiatry conference, which was mostly neuroscientists and neuropsychiatrists and psychologists who basically are only doing like assessment of not so much some mental health, but more kind of brain diseases. And one of the authorities at a local hospital here in Boston called Brigham and Women, who studies Alzheimer's disease and dementia, did a fabulous presentation. And I am not exaggerating to say the number one intervention and the number one predictor of developing Alzheimer's or dementia was the rate of physical activity, the level of physical activity. So we know that there's a gene that predisposes someone to Alzheimer's. That gene aside, the other really, really strong predictor is exercise. So it's really not to be understated how good it is for your brain.
That's crazy.
It's crazy.
Like that's
Yeah.
wild.
Yes.
So then how would you go about building and developing that mental resiliency? Because I would imagine that, you do have some sort of an upper limit or threshold for your tolerance to stress and things like that you were kind of discussing earlier.
Yeah.
Is there some sort of like wiggle room if you optimize, let's say, your environment and some of the epigenetic factors that
Yeah.
are available to you?
It's an awesome question. And I would say you can look at your own expertise in strength training to use that. So one topic I love to talk about with my friend Mike T. Nelson is this idea of anti-fragility, that human beings, when you expose us to stress or put us under stress, we can get stronger or we can break depending on how much it is. So when you're training somebody, you want to find a weight that's as heavy as it can be without injuring the person that they're physically capable of picking up, right? So you're looking for that pocket. What's enough that it's challenging and stresses their body, but not so challenging that you break them or that they're not able to pick up the weight. And so that's the window for your body and to get strong physically. And that's the window for your brain and how to get stronger mentally, or what's called mental toughness or resilience. So it's choosing activities, it's choosing hobbies, it's choosing professional pursuits or personal relationships that challenge you, that stimulate you, that maybe stress you and push you, but that do not cause distress and impairment. In other words, break you.
Yeah, so it's like a dose response relationship, like enough to get
Exactly.
better, but not so much that you're just going crazy and you can't handle
You
anything.
got it. You got it.
So one guy that I really like, this guy Grant Cardone. He's not in the fitness field at all. He's in sales and real estate and stuff like that. But
Okay.
one of the things that he always says about getting better, anyways, from like when he's giving maybe lectures or something like that, is he always talks about how you want new problems. He's like, always look to gain new problems. So when I was starting out my business, we didn't have any clients. That was a problem. Then I got to the point where I was so busy that I actually had clients dropping off because I couldn't fulfill their services. He's like, that's a good problem to have. Don't slow down, keep hammering and find a way to deal with that problem. And then once you deal with that problem, then he talks about like higher class problems.
Yeah.
And I mean, like even right now, like, again, I live in Canada. I mean, the problems we have here are really not problems. Like when I was growing up, we lived in a very difficult environment before I came here. And like, those are problems. I lived in India. Those are problems. Over here, it's like, oh my God, my tire's flat. And it's like, oh, your tire to your Mercedes that you drive to work. And like, sorry, I don't feel bad for you. You know what I mean? Like, even though it's a problem, it's really like, it's like, come on, be grateful for those problems. Those are high quality problems to have.
So in recovery, in 12-step programs, we call those luxury problems.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And that's what you're talking about. So there's two ways to look at that. One is it's good to keep things in perspective. Like you're doing perspective taking, saying in the grand scheme of things, this is a good problem to have. The other thing to remember is that people experience distress when they get to the lower end of that reaction range. So somebody who's like totally happy and they're a super ass kicker and they're really high functioning and they're like operating at a 9 on a scale of 10 all the time, when they have a loss or they have something bad happen or they come down with an illness and they're like at a 7, that feels really bad for them, because of what they're used to, as compared to, often we find that some of the happiest people are people who actually live in second world countries, who they have food, they have water, they have access to healthcare, they're safe. Those people actually report high levels of happiness and well-being because they have what they need. So we might look at it and say, oh my gosh, we have such a great life compared to them, but we have this sort of more money, more problems kind of situation in the richer countries where we tend to report higher levels of distress, because of what you're saying, having these, I guess, bigger or high under problems or just being used to being at that upper limit. We get stressed when these things happen, when in perspective of the grand scheme of things, maybe they're not the biggest deal.
Right.
So I think looking at it from both ways, like I don't want people out there to think my problems aren't valid and I'm being silly or I'm being entitled. No, I want you to recognize that if you are in distress or you are stressed out, something is pushing you to the lower limit of your reaction range. And what is that? And how can you counteract that? So I don't want to invalidate it. On the other hand, it can be a coping technique to say, my biggest problem, is that my tire popped on the interstate and I had to call AAA or whomever. And that's really awesome as compared to not having enough water to drink today. So to the point that it's soothing and it helps you to cope, that's awesome. But if it makes you feel like bad for your problem, that's not helpful.
Yeah, that's a great point. So kind of coming back to nutrition then, what sort of role does nutrition have on mental health? I know, at least just for me personally, if I am not well fed, I get angry, like super angry and moody and violent. I'm just like not a nice person to be around. I know with my ex, every time I'd like come and if I was kind of like upset or something, she'd be like, "Have you eaten?" I'm like, I don't know. She's like, "Okay, let's get you fed. Let's get you fed, big guy." And then she like make me some food and then I'd be great and then I'd be all happy again. So it's like it's such a huge thing. And but obviously just kind of beyond those like more basic things, how does nutrition impact your brain? How does it impact your psychology, your ability to even just cope with stressors when they're introduced into the system?
This is a fascinating area, and I'm certainly more of a student than I am an expert in this area. So I'm sure that there's people who actually spend their life researching this. And in fact, I have looked at some papers that look at the influence of different kinds of food or food groups on things like depression, anxiety, attention, autism spectrum, so on and so forth. I think the big rock statement that I can make is that there are foods that cause inflammation, and there are foods that have a neutral effect on the body, and then there are foods that work like medicine. And so I have read some pretty compelling studies about the impact of having a really inflammatory diet on anxiety and depression in particular. I have read a couple papers that study, for example, the impact of gluten in the microbiomes of people who have autism spectrum disorder. And there are anecdotes of young people who have gone on gluten-free diets and or dairy-free diets, just low inflammation diets or low inflammatory diets, who have had significant improvement in their symptoms. So without a doubt, what you eat impacts your microbiome, and we call your gut your second brain. It is closely wired with the brain in your head. And there is a very significant interaction there that we are really just starting to put our finger on and be able to understand. How does that translate to day to day, talking with people and clients? I'm always asking my clients how they're eating. And I'm listening for a couple things. I'm listening for how inflammatory that diet might be. So how much processed food that might have a really high level of sugar, might be spiking their insulin, how much of that is going on. And then how much food are they having that might have a high omega-3 content, or are they supplementing with fish oil or omega-3s that might either help to balance or have a positive effect. I do have a friend who's a psychiatrist, and she said that fish oil has been used or is written kind of off label by some psychiatrists to treat things like bipolar disorder, major depression, because it has this anti-inflammatory effect on the brain and on the body. So I think there's a lot more to come on that. But even if you're somebody who doesn't know thing one about the brain, you know that some foods spike your insulin, that insulin is a hormone, and that hormone is going to impact your eating habits, your sleeping habits, your mood, your consciousness, your ability to attend and to focus. And so by taking better care of what you're eating, you are taking better care of your hormone levels and thereby your neurochemistry. So I think people have to consider themselves and their nutrition like a little N of one study, where you can pay attention to how foods make you feel. If they make you feel like crap, they're probably not doing good things on the inside of your body. And if you feel fabulous after you eat them, that's probably important data. I am not one to promote like elimination diet or doing any kind of diet in particular. I am a huge advocate for paying close attention to how certain foods make you feel and for eating a broad range of things. So, for example, if dairy is bad for you and it makes you feel bad and icky, but once a month you just really want some blue cheese or some ice cream, you should do that and you should figure that out. So I'm not a person who has black and white beliefs, but nutrition and mental health are very, very closely related. And I think we're going to find out a lot more detail about that in the decade to come.
Yeah, and I really loved how you kind of emphasized the awareness piece, because that is so important. And I actually literally this morning, or maybe last night, I can't remember, I did a little Q&A. I haven't done a Q&A in a long time, and I got just like flooded with questions. And one of them was, do you get everyone to track macros, or what? How do you manage someone's diet without tracking macros or something like that?
Okay.
And one of the things that I said was, well, unless they specifically have a disorder, like a history of disordered eating or something like that, I always get everyone to track macros for a couple of months, because most people have terrible awareness of what they're actually eating. And they don't understand, exactly like you said, they don't pay attention to how they feel. Like I'll get clients in, like some of my athletes, and they're like, yeah, I'm bloated all the time, I'm this and this. And I'm like, well, what are you eating, man?
Right. And they have no idea.
Exactly. And then all of a sudden they start tracking. The first week, I'm always like, they always tell me, oh my God, I didn't realize I ate so much crap. And I'm like, okay, well, let's just keep going and not really worry about that too much. Just get more accurate at tracking every single thing.
Right.
Then we get everything in, and then we're like, okay, how have you been feeling? And they're like, well, not very good. And it's like, okay, what's the first step that we can take? We start making small adjustments here and there, whatever pace they can go and tolerate. And then eventually, after a couple of months, they have this completely new level of appreciation for the caloric density of food, the nutritional content of food, like phytonutrients, getting a variety of different vitamins and minerals, their hydration status. All of a sudden, like their training check-ins, they're like, oh yeah, I just didn't feel that energized today, but I actually realized that it was because yesterday I was kind of dehydrated. I went out for a really long run, didn't do this, didn't put some salt in my water, blah blah blah. And like their feedback is just exponentially better because it's like, it's really crazy to think how something as critical as like what you're consuming to keep you alive ends up being such a distant thought, and I get how, with being busy, having kids and having a career and whatever else is going on in people's lives, it's easy for those things to kind of slip away. But I mean, especially if you're busy, it's kind of sort of counterintuitive, but you need to emphasize that stuff even more so you can have the resiliency to just do more and be more productive and rebound quicker and get better sleep and do all that stuff. So it's kind of wild.
I completely agree. And I think, again, I know this idea is spoken about a lot in economics in regard to, well, let me just let me just make the example. I think there are people who have plenty of time on their hands and probably, have like enough time and enough money where they can take good care of the nutrition. And then there's people who are like super busy and probably super rich, who can have people like cook their food and buy their food and take care of their menu and manage all that. And then there's most of us who are somewhere in the middle where, like you said, we can't afford to have a private chef and somebody to do our grocery shopping. But we're pretty stressed and we're pretty busy, and we could really benefit a lot from taking good care of our nutrition. So I think that's the rub. It's like we probably need it the most, but we have a smaller amount of bandwidth to really give to it.
Yeah. And I mean, the funny thing too is that people are so stuck on this kind of dichotomous style of thinking where, it's an all or nothing. And the number of times I hear people saying that, it's like, oh, well, I just got to get this, diet and know exactly what I can and can't eat. And it's like, why don't we just start with one thing and see how it works? Then if that's good, then we can keep going. And they're always like, no, but I did this before. And I'm like, okay, well, then why don't you still have the results? Oh, because you couldn't do it. Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's just dial it back and assume that maybe there's some things that didn't work out. We could do a little bit better this time. Actually, one thing I wanted to add, sorry, finish your thought.
No, I was going to say, yes, that's my shtick. My shtick is nutrition is a long game. It's a really, really long game. So one thing at a time is worthwhile, to your point, that if you try to up and become an intermittent faster or eliminate all these things at once, or you did terrible because you had pizza night or whatever, is just, that's not the point.
Yeah. Yeah. The lack of patience is tough sometimes.
Totally. Anyway, go ahead.
So what I wanted to ask was, coming back to exercise, I wanted to know if you were aware of any sort of difference in terms of the modality you're utilizing, like whether it's more cardiovascular based, if it's strength training, hypertrophy, different types of conditioning, or maybe even just regular sporting activities like ultimate frisbee, football, whatever. Like, is there any really significant difference in terms of the impact that has on your mental health, or are they all just kind of like pretty darn good?
Okay, so I have two different kinds of answers for this. My first answer, which is based on my professional experience and based on research in like motivation and sustainable exercise, is it all depends on what you enjoy and what you're motivated to do. So like ultimate frisbee could be like the number one calorie burner and like the best possible thing for your mental health. But if you don't play it or you don't have access to it, who cares, or if you don't like it. So the thing that the person will do, the thing that they enjoy or the thing that they want to get better at, they invest time and energy in improving their competency. That's the thing that's going to get them the most bang for their buck. So when I am talking to somebody about getting going and they want to have some benefits of exercise, either physically or mentally, I start by asking, what do you like? What have you done before in your life? Is there anything you're interested in? My other answer is, what does the literature say about this? And a lot of the research on the impact of physical activity on brain health and mental health is cardiovascular. I think the main reason is because it's super measurable. So you can tell somebody to get to a certain heart rate or to be on the treadmill for a certain amount of time. So there's the body of literature on resistance training, on lifting weights, is smaller. Last year, I was on a dissertation committee for somebody or 2 years ago, who was looking at the impact of resistance training on cognition and attention. And there's just very little that's out there. The other thing that there's much less of is like HIIT training or interval training. What is the impact of really high intensity interval training? I saw one really cool MRI study on a difference between kind of steady state cardio and high interval training and different ways that the brain responded. But it was like 10 participants. And, they were like, there's really not much in this area. So I think we have a lot more to learn about that. What I will say is when people exercise and they do something they think is badass, it improves their self-esteem. And then it improves their self-efficacy at their ability to do it, which also, both of those things have benefits to mental health. So if somebody finds an activity that they feel proud that they did after they did it, that's going to be good. And if somebody feels like they admire themselves, that's what self-esteem is, holding yourself in esteem. So if they esteem weightlifting or rock climbing or running a half marathon or whatever, that is going to have a positive effect.
Awesome. No, that makes sense. It's yeah, I remember reading that previously, that most of the research was on cardiovascular health.
Yeah.
I would like to see, I guess, a little bit more on that, but I mean, yeah, it makes sense that just due to like kind of practical limitations, especially the people who would be seeking out help for mental health, maybe.
Well, and one of the main arguments, I'm remembering the lecture I heard from the individual I told you about from Brigham and Women's Hospital who was lecturing on Alzheimer's. They think that exercise is really good for the brain because, number one, of how much increased blood flow you get into your brain. So if your heart's working harder, then you're increasing your circulation, you're getting a lot of blood flow up there to the brain. So you're just giving that organ a lot more oxygen, a lot more blood flow. So cardiovascular is measuring that. Now, there's a lot of people out there listening to this who are like, yeah, well, my finisher or my kettlebell swings or my whatever is definitely getting my heart rate up. So I think that those of us who know fitness have all had a strength training session that's a really hard cardiovascular workout. So you're getting that benefit. It's just that when this has been studied in a controlled environment or in a lab setting where they're hooking people up to things, they've been doing it with kind of that traditional model of cardiovascular activity. What I think is so fantastic about strength training and about weightlifting is that as people become more and more competent, like you said, they have to start doing more complex things. They start to have to lift heavier weight, and they start to enjoy that or appreciate that. In other words, even though it's painful and it's uncomfortable, there is this effect on the individual, like, I can do this, I can work harder, I can get stronger. And they start to think about it in this, I guess, scientific way, by increasing their volume or increasing the load that they're bearing, or by increasing their calories, they're going to get stronger. And I think all of the mindset, all of those ideas you need for getting stronger physically are easily transferable into what you need to get mentally stronger.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And it's so funny because coming back to your initial comment of the whole, like, all roads lead to Rome, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think anytime you specialize in something, whether it's like darts, curling, cards, fitness, sports, whatever it is, that process might look different in application, but the process itself is almost the same.
Yeah.
Like, it requires dedication, patience, attention, passion, dealing with frustration, that whole mental toughness and resiliency. Like, I look at myself when I first started lifting weights, and I tell this to everyone because it's kind of embarrassing, right? Like, I went into an Olympic weightlifting gym and the women were outlifting me, and that's not a joke. It's not like one chick was who just happened to be really strong. All of them were outlifting me because I was just terribly weak. And, and then it's like, almost 10 years later, and I'm a little bit stronger now, so it's kind of crazy to think like, there's no way I would be able to handle any of this stuff, or even just like whatever, life experiences have happened back then. And I think a lot of that stuff is so transferable or transmissible to just life, as cliche as that sounds. You learn these things in training where you're like, hey, you know what? These things are correlated. They're not necessarily causal. And so this situation is probably also causal. And you kind of start to differentiate between those things and have a little bit more of a reasonable perspective on different situations. And so
it is so empowering to see that you
hugely.
are able to change your body and the way that works. And I really think that there's something so empowering for all of us who strength train to understand, like, if I work hard and I change my behaviors, I can have an outcome that I want. It's just a matter of how hard I'm willing to work for this. And actually, people might laugh when they hear me say this, but Arnold Schwarzenegger in his autobiography talks a lot about that, about how many lessons he learned from bodybuilding as a young man that were transferable into his career as an actor and his career as a politician. I think it's unbelievably empowering. And I really think it's like a mental health skill to think about resilience in this similar way as building strength in your body.
So funny, actually, because I read Arnold's autobiography and Mike Tyson's autobiography back to back,
Huh.
and they were just worlds apart. Like
I
Mike
bet they
Tyson was
were.
just one tragedy after another, and then
Uh-huh.
Arnold's was just like, I swear to God, like he was just like crushing it every single page, and then the part where he got divorced,
Yeah.
2 pages,
Yep.
and then he just went right back to crushing it again. And I'm like,
Yeah.
man, this tells you so much about where each of these individuals are coming from, like in
Yeah.
their headspace. It was so cool to see that kind of dichotomy from reading them back to back. It was really wild, but it was definitely an interesting book. Um,
Yeah.
just to I guess double back to what you were saying about the physical transformations. Like, I don't really coach people who like physique based,
Mm-hmm.
so I don't really coach bodybuilders or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
I do have them, and most of my athletes have a physique goal that's secondary, but they're predominantly strength athletes.
Okay.
But back in the day, just being a PT kind of starting out, everyone wanted to get in shape and look better and lose weight and stuff like that, basically. And I remember seeing so many people who would come in and they're like, I want to look skinny because I want to be confident in my
Mm-hmm.
body and blah, blah, blah. And
Mm-hmm.
I would try and explain to them that, like, so much of that feeling of empowerment and autonomy that you were just talking about is process driven as opposed to outcome driven, because it's like they start being like, oh my God, I never thought I could lift this weight, like you were saying, and all of a
Yeah.
sudden I'm crushing this weight. I've lost 10 pounds. I'm still 30 pounds away from my goal, but I did this. I never thought I'd be able to do it. Oh my God, what else can I do? You know? And it just kind of starts opening up that, like, what if? And that on its own is like, that's where I think the real transformation comes from, not necessarily like someone's external appearance. That obviously might help, but I don't think that it's strong enough to really cause a deep change. I think that would be
Mm-hmm.
superficial in nature. And so it's interesting that you kind of brought that up. Um, Let me just see here. One of the last, I guess, we're kind of coming up. We're almost at that hour mark, so I want to be respectful of your time. Just one
Thank you.
last question, I guess, is, do you know of any good resources that people can utilize to, who maybe are dealing with things like that? I made a post not too long ago. I guess it was Men's Mental Health Week. I never really follow these things. It's like in Canada, every single week is a new holiday. But I made
Mm-hmm.
a post about it because I actually recently started working with a clinician for PTSD, and
That's
it's
great,
been
Daniel.
pretty helpful, actually. Like, it's
Yeah.
kind of hard to say exactly what it is, but I feel better. And my responses are different. I'm not having as many episodes and things like that, so I feel like it's
Yeah.
definitely trending in the right direction. And I think that a lot of people deal with things in silence, and that don't necessarily need to. And so, do you have any resources or places that people can reach out for, depression, anxiety, whatever, that they can maybe get some additional help with?
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing your own experience. I think that makes a huge difference. I think that's a huge resource for people to know that it's helpful to talk to somebody. There's a book right now that I'm planning to read, and it's called "I Think You Should Talk to Someone," and it's written by a therapist who's in therapy. So
Just
part of the
super
book,
straight up. Yeah.
yeah, part of
Love
it
it.
is about her experience in therapy, and part of it is her experience with her clients. I'm really looking forward to reading it. But I have a therapist. I am the most biased person on earth, but I personally feel that everybody should have one. And if this is an audience of people who have a nutrition coach or a strength coach or any of those other things, then it's congruent with your values to think about talking to someone. And you don't have to have a diagnosable mental health condition that is like in your way every single day in order to ask for that. Um, the number one resource that I recommend for people is to go to Psychology Today. And this is used in Canada and the United States, psychologytoday.com. It is a directory of mental health professionals that are licensed, and you can put in the area that you live in. You can put in what type of health insurance you have if you want to use health insurance. You can enter in what gender practitioner you want to work with. You can put in different concerns or issues that you might want that person to have specialty in. And what you will get is a list of providers that are licensed in your area who have a photograph and a bio and information like what kinds of therapy they practice, what their fees are, etc. And I think it's extremely useful to go on there and look, because it's like shopping. It's kind of like being on Match.com. The number one most important predictor of whether or not therapy is going to be useful is the quality of the relationship between the client and the counselor. So whether that person's a psychiatrist, a psychologist, or a master's level social worker, mental health counselor, if you feel that that person is trustworthy, if you feel that you can connect with that person, that they understand you, and if there's good rapport, the outcome is most likely going to be positive. So it's important for you to shop and look for that person, because you're probably going to pick somebody who, I don't know, either the photo speaks to you or the bio resonates, or when you call them, that first phone call that you have with them, that's 5 minutes or 10 minutes, that's just like a little hello, is going to help you to feel like, yeah, this person is picking up what I'm putting down. That is very, very important. Even if you're not sure that you're ready, I still would encourage people, just go on there. Psychology Today has like jillions of articles and blogs that are all written by mental health professionals on every single topic. It's very approachable and digestible. Of course, they have a popular magazine that people are probably familiar with as well. But I really encourage you to go there, whether you read or you shop for a provider. That's my number one go-to these days.
Awesome. That's great. And so where can people find you?
Thank you. My website is drlewisconsulting.com. And on my website, you can find links to podcasts like this or articles that I have authored. You can also find my course. If there are fitness professionals listening, I offer a continuing education course called Psych Skills for Fit Pros. And you can find the link to Psych Skills for Fit Pros there on my website. And please follow me on Instagram. I'm at Dr. Lewis Consulting. And I try about 3 times a week to post something that integrates physical activity or strength and conditioning in with mental health or psychology. So that's my little baby, and it's easy to follow it and get those little nuggets throughout the week.
Awesome. So definitely go make sure you give her a follow on Instagram and check out her website, as well as the resource that she listed. All of this stuff is going to be linked up in the show notes, guys. So make sure you click and check it out. Lisa, thank you so much for jumping on the episode. It was a really, really great chat. I loved it.
Thank you, Daniel. It's a pleasure.